Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to you all to our second keynote address in this conference. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Reem Saab. I'm an assistant professor of psychology here at AUB, and I am one of the conveners of this conference. I'm delighted to be introducing our special keynote speaker today, Professor Nadje Al-Ali. She is Professor of Gender Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, also known as SOAS, in the University of London. She is currently the chair of the Center for Gender Studies and also head of the doctoral school at SOAS. Her main research interests revolve around feminist activism, transnational migration and diaspora mobilization, war, conflict and peace, as well as art and cultural studies, mainly with reference to Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, and the Kurdish political movement. Her publications include various books such as What Kind of Liberation? Women and the Occupation of Iraq, published with University of California Press in 2009, co-authored with Nicola Pratt. Another book is Secularism, Gender and the State in the Middle East, published with Cambridge University Press in 2000, as well as numerous book chapters and journal articles. Her co-edited book with Deborah Al-Najjar, entitled We Are Iraqis, Aesthetics and Politics in a Time of War, won the 2014 Arab American Book Prize for Nonfiction. Professor Al-Ali was president of the Association of the Middle East Women's Studies from 2009 to 2011. She is also a member of the Feminist Review Collective and was a founding member of Act Together, Women's Action for Iraq. She was involved in several projects with Iraqi academics and women's rights activists with the aim to facilitate the introduction of women and gender studies and increase evidence-based research capacity in Iraq. Like yesterday, today's talk will engage with the question of what feminism can accomplish at this specific historical juncture in the region, as well as transnationally. Drawing on her research and activism, Professor Al-Ali will examine what are the multiple and complex crises we are confronted with, how do we approach them analytically, and how do we strategize politically. She will take us through what she sees to be the accomplishments and the challenges to feminisms in the region and transnationally, while paying particular attention to the complex relationship between feminist academia and activism. This is our last lecture in this conference, and I am certain that we will be ending on a high note. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nadje Al-Ali.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I should say that I sent that abstract before I actually wrote the talk, so I don't think I'm doing quite that, but I also find it a bit daunting to give a talk, the sort of final talk in this context with so many colleagues and activists here, but I'll try my best. So, in March 2017, the Iraqi parliament and media experienced a huge uproar after Jamila Al-Obeidi called for the promotion of polygamy in order to support and help the high number of widows, divorcees, and single women. Al-Obeida, a female member of the Iraqi parliament from the National Coalition, convened a press conference encouraging women to denounce the culture of monogamy. Aside from demanding the lifting of legal restrictions making polygamy difficult, she recommended financial incentives to encourage men and help them to marry more than one woman, and to double these incentives for those who marry a widow or a divorcee. Opinions amongst MPs, journalists, and the general public were extremely polarized in reaction to the female MP's statement. Many Sunni and Shia female MPs alike expressed their outrage at the suggestion, which in their view was demeaning to women, with one angry female MP even slapping Al-Obeida and throwing a shoe. And as you all know, that is the worst thing that you can do in Iraqi culture. However, some female and male MPs, journalists, writers, and religious figures praised Al-Obeidi and stressed the religious roots of her argumentation. Now, while this particular debate lacked the sectarian undertones of many other heated discussions and conflicts in contemporary Iraq, it illustrated both the centrality of gender issues in contestations of the new Iraq, as well as the limitations of numerical representation in terms of women's political participation. This was not the first time in post-invasion Iraq that gender issues took center stage in political and media debates. In fact, questions around women's legal rights, their political representation, as well as gender-based and domestic violence have constituted symbolic markers of difference between the Ba'ath regime and new forms of governance in central and southern Iraq, as well as between Sunni and Shia Islamist constituencies, and also the Kurdish regional government in the north and the central government in Baghdad. One other example that you probably have heard of, and I don't have time to go into, are the contestations and debates around the personal status code which emerged after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I assume that many of you have heard about this, so I'm not going to go into the history, but just to mention here that the debate around the personal status code became even more heated after Justice Minister Hassan al-Shimari, formerly head of the Shia Islamic Virtue Party, a rival to the Sadrist movement, introduced a draft law to the Council of Ministers in October 2013, and the draft law came to be known as the Jaffrey Personal Status Law, based on the principles of the Jaffrey School of Shia Religious Jurisprudence. Now, the draft law included provisions that prohibit Muslim men from marrying non-Muslims, legalizes marital rape by stating that a husband is entitled to have sex with his wife regardless of her consent, and prevents women from leaving the house without permission from their husbands. Now, the law would automatically grant custody over any child aged 2 or older to the father in divorce cases, lower the marriage age to 9 for girls and 15 for boys, and even allow girls younger than 9 to be married with a parent's approval. The draft law was vehemently opposed by many constituents of the Iraqi public, but most prominently it was Iraqi feminists who opposed it and campaigned against it inside Iraq and internationally. There was great relief when the law was not passed by Parliament in 2014. But it might not be a coincidence that on 1st of November 2017, shortly after the date for the presidential elections, the next presidential elections were announced to be May 2018, 2 parliamentary commissions started seeking to once again try to introduce a sectarian personal status code along the lines of the previous suggested Jaffrey law. Fortunately, it was also voted down after vigorous campaigning and advocacy by Iraqi feminists both inside Iraq and in the diaspora. Now, I've started my talk with this very specific example in Iraq, in relation to Iraq, to illustrate several points. First of all, and I don't want to fall into the trap of linear modernist thinking in terms of progress, but I would suggest that our feminist foremothers, whether in Iraq or elsewhere in the region, who started organizing over 100 years ago, would have been horrified to know that several generations down the line, feminists would actually have to put up a fight to prevent polygamy, marital rape, and child marriage. Now, throughout the conference, we have heard several examples of struggles and challenges that feminists face in specific contexts that none of us could have predicted a couple of decades ago. Secondly, and to put a more positive spin on this, the Iraqi case shows that the lobbying and advocacy of feminists in the midst of authoritarianism, Islamism, sectarianism, and militarism had an impact and influenced the vote in parliament and prevented an extremely regressive and problematic law to pass. Another example from the Kurdish region of Iraq is that of female Kurdish MPs and feminist activists who worked together over many years to introduce a law that criminalizes gender-based violence for the first time. This is after years of the Kurdish government turning a blind eye to various forms of extreme gender-based violence. Now, I'm sure that many of you coming from different parts of the region or having worked in different contexts can provide examples of feminist campaigns to introduce, influence, change, or oppose new legislation. Sometimes we are successful and sometimes we fail. However, even if we are successful, we are also aware of the limitations of a liberal rights-based approach. Gender-based violence did not stop in Iraqi Kurdistan because of the introduction of a new law. We know that the Kurdish regional government is not actually exerting much effort to implement the law, and instead continues to encourage informal and alternative ways of dispute and conflict resolution, which often entails sending battered women back home to keep the peace of the family. In central and southern Iraq, polygamy has been on the rise since the sanctions period, whatever parliament says, and sadly, underage girls are increasingly married off, whatever the law. As we have learned a long time ago, we cannot stop at laws. But that does not mean that we should stop lobbying, advocating, and campaigning to improve laws and constitutions to provide the legal framework for a fairer, more just, and equal society. It is one of the strategies we need to pursue and can't afford to abandon, in my view, even if we recognize that we cannot rely on law and constitutions to deliver justice and equality to women. Thirdly, the Iraqi case also illustrates that inclusion alone, that is an increase of representation of women numerically, whether through a quota or other means, is not transformative in and of itself, and might even contribute to backlashes and conservative agendas. We know that quotas alone might just lead to a scenario where we have the wives, sisters, and daughters of conservative male politicians enter parliaments or other decision-making bodies. Yet we also know that if it was not for the 25% quota enshrined in the Iraqi constitution, probably no woman would have entered parliament in the past decade. And some women, even if a minority, who made it into parliament have managed to challenge their conservative female and male counterparts across sectarian and ethnic lines. Now, while including women, whether by sitting in parliament or at tables during peace negotiations, is not going to be sufficient to challenge patriarchal norms and practices, I would argue that, again, we cannot afford to not fight for inclusion. But quotas and other forms of increased representation can only be one tactic amongst many as part of a wider strategy. For example, in the context of the Kurdish women's movement linked to the PKK and its sister organization, the PYD in Syria, all leadership positions and decision-making posts are shared between a woman and a man as part of a wider attempt to center gender-based equality and justice within the political project of democratic autonomy. Some of you might already be aware that the Kurdish political movement linked to the PKK has officially abandoned the idea of an independent Kurdistan and is advocating for radical democracy within existing nation-states, arguing that nation-states are the ultimate form of patriarchal power. Achieving radical democratic autonomy, so the argument goes, has to go hand in hand with radically transforming gender relations by challenging patriarchal power. Women have been involved in armed warfare, largely contextualized and perceived as self-defense. They have established their own independent political structures and organizations, and they hold leadership positions side by side with men. Now, I should say that I was initially quite skeptical about the idea of co-chairing, given my insights into and experiences with the ways that quotas have been playing out in Iraq and other places globally, not just in the region. But I personally have been very humbled and inspired by the Kurdish women activists, MPs, and co-mayors, who are clearly not merely token women or making up numbers. They are in the process of trying to transform the way the Kurdish political movement does politics and thinks about specific concepts. So, for instance, the concept of conflict. I was very intrigued that the Kurdish women I talked to in southeastern Turkey would think of conflict as not just conflict with the state, but equally important conflict with men, with patriarchy, including Kurdish men. Now, I'll get back to this specific struggle later on, but here I would like to develop the dilemma of recognizing the limitations of a liberal rights-based approach to feminism without being able to discard our struggles for legal rights and inclusion. We have been challenged to widen our perspectives and connect the dots, and to recognize that we are faced with multiple intersecting crises at global, regional, national, and local levels. In the Iraqi context, there's a direct relationship between the radically shifting political economy during the sanctions period, so that's from 1991 to 2003, and a shift towards social conservatism, especially in relation to gender norms and relations, including the increase in polygamy, child marriage, and the control of women's bodies and sexualities. The political economy of the occupation and the corruption of the sectarian militia and Islamist political parties have helped to privilege not only militarized masculinities, but have also worked to marginalize women further and restrain their mobility and contributions to employment, politics, cultural lives, and so on. Economy matters, and as feminists, we have to become more savvy in that regard. I myself feel challenged to not merely recognize the basic principles, namely that lack of access to resources, especially those that would keep an adequate infrastructure going, high numbers of unemployment or underemployment, gender pay gaps, uncontrolled privatization, and the principles of neoliberal markets all negatively affect gender norms and relations. More of us need to learn the language and tools of economists to decipher, interpret, and challenge the figures, statistics, and trends we are being confronted with. Historically, feminist scholars have tried to avoid numbers and statistics for good reason, because for too long they were presented to us as all that mattered, with this positive spirit of scientific objectivity. Yet, just as we need feminists to be learned in, and I hope I don't offend anyone now, but I think that just as we need feminists to be learned in religious scriptures and challenge their interpretations by conservative and sexist men, we need feminists to be educated and understand macro and microeconomic developments and trends. I should say that I'm not volunteering myself, but I hope that others will. By now, I also increasingly realize that we cannot reduce the systematic forms of oppression, abuse, marginalization, and range of gender-based violence that women are experiencing in Iraq and elsewhere in the region to the effects of neoliberal economics. Nor, as I've argued previously, and this might be more controversial, can we explain away the many challenges that Iraqi women are facing today merely by pointing to the invasion and occupation alone. Now, those of you who are familiar with my writings on Iraq know that I've previously reflected on my constant need to argue against culturalization of the discourses around gender, which motivated much of my earlier writings on Iraq. For a long time, I felt compelled to challenge what was clearly an ahistorical, orientalist, racist, and Islamophobic depiction of what was happening to Iraqi women and gender norms and relations. But again, this trend has, of course, been relevant in other contexts. We are all familiar with the "it is because of their culture, it is because of their religion" rhetoric, which is prevalent within much of the Western media and policy circles. But as I've stated before, a dichotomous approach that is focusing on imperialist policies and neoliberal economics on the one hand, and on the other hand, focusing on patriarchal cultural attitudes and practices, is unhelpful and more reflective of specific and often quite divergent positionalities rather than the complex empirical realities we are facing as activists and academics. Culture matters, and so do the ways that religion, that is mainly Islam, is being interpreted and practiced. I would also add that we need to avoid pitching materialist approaches that focus on legal frameworks, economic conditions, political structures and developments, social institutions, and so on, against post-structuralist approaches focusing on language, discourse, and representation. Rather than contributing to the taboo and silencing of sexual and wider gender-based violence and other forms of marginalization, discrimination, and sidelining on the one hand, and the sensationalizing and essentialist culturalist discourses on the other, we need to find nuanced and truly intersectional ways to talk and write. So the Iraqi context today, being nuanced and intersectional, translates into a recognition that US and UK actions and policies linked to the invasion and occupation have contributed to the deterioration of women's rights and the increase in gender-based and sexual violence, while simultaneously paying attention to and recognizing that local manifestations of militarized and neoliberal patriarchal gender norms and relations are also rooted in regional, national, and local power dynamics and struggles, as well as historically specific contestations over resources, cultures, and identities. And crucially, I think it's important to point out that gender-based and sexual violence did not simply emerge post-2003, but has a long history, especially during the Ba'ath regime. Now, the fabric and mechanisms of patriarchy are complex, overlapping, and span across local, national, regional, and transnational spheres and contexts. As feminists, we are increasingly challenged to understand and find strategies to deal with the way that intersectionality works on so many different levels. But we're also tasked with recognizing the actors and processes that reproduce patriarchy in any given empirical and discursive context. And we're also always challenged to grasp the complex ways that patriarchy adapts itself to changing contexts. Denise Gandiotti has made the point several times over the past years that we cannot simply explain away the targeting of women's dress codes, their mobility, their sexuality, and their presence during protests, and the fact that they are political actors as manifestations of patriarchy and misogyny. Gandiotti states that patriarchy no longer functions as usual and requires a higher level of coercion and the deployment of more varied ideological state apparatuses to ensure its reproduction. Therefore, she argues, the high levels of violence against women since 2011 are evidence of a logic of masculinist restoration that seeks to restore patriarchy. So is a cracking down on men who do not fit the norm of heteronormativity. However, what we see unfolding is also evidence of a masculinist restoration that is no longer built on a patriarchal consensus. Many men, and that I think has been particularly evident in Egypt and Turkey, but also elsewhere in the region, have started to make the connections between patriarchy and political authoritarianism, often mediated through militarism and heteronormativity. I think we also need to add that it is necessary to disaggregate men who are differently positioned in terms of their class backgrounds, their ethnicities, religion, and sexualities, and so on, having very different relationships to power, leading to different projects of masculinist restoration. In particular, there's a difference between the restoration projects of working class, lower middle class, and migrant men who are struggling to provide for their families and fulfill their social expectations of breadwinner masculinities as a result of several decades of neoliberal economic reforms and as a result of war and conflict, as opposed to male political and military elites whose restoration projects are intrinsically bound up with the consolidation of their power and authority. And then, of course, we have masculinist restoration based on the anxieties around challenges to heteronormativity. The issue of masculinist restoration takes on a particular meaning in the context of extremely militarized societies like Iraq, as well as in the context of Islamist radicalization as it continues to unfold in its Sunni and Shia variations all over the region. Yet as feminist scholars and activists, we are faced with an anomaly that appears to challenge a range of different historical and cross-cultural examples of the close relationship between militarization of societies and increases in gender-based violence. Over the last years, we have witnessed a women's revolution, including in parts of southeastern Turkey and in northern Syria, where Kurdish women have not only been at the forefront of armed resistance against Daesh, but they have also been involved in the attempt to build a radically different society that puts gender equality at its center. But before reflecting more on the Kurdish women's movement, let me diverge here for a moment and make a plea for more inclusive conceptualization of feminisms in the region. Having worked in and on Iraq for over 2 decades, I have been made aware and sensitized to the importance of not thinking in Arab hegemonic terms when talking about feminists and feminism, given the ethnic diversity in Iraq. Aside from Kurdish women, there are Syrian, Yazidi, Chaldean, Shabak, to name just a few, all women who are not Arab and are involved in feminist activism. Ethnic minorities, and of course also religious minorities, live in majority Arab countries in the region. If we take intersectionality seriously, I think we should become more alert to the fact that Arab is not the only ethnic or political denomination existent in the region. And this morning, some of us listened to Mena Aga, who spoke about Nubian feminists in Egypt and the kinds of issues they're facing. Moreover, I would say that there are so many parallels and commonalities with the struggles of feminist activists and scholars in Turkey and Iran, which tend to be obscured by insisting on Arab as the lens through which we identify ourselves or the feminists we work on. I suspect many of you would feel uncomfortable if you would speak about the Muslim region and Muslim or Islamic feminism just because the majority religion is Islam. Now, returning back to the Kurdish women's movement, in recent years it has promoted the idea of genealogy, often described as the creation of a woman's paradigm, which was first introduced by Abdullah Öcalan, the founder of the PKK. Attempting to develop the epistemological and theoretical underpinnings of the transformative practices and politics developed by Kurdish women activists, the women cadres and wider Kurdish political movement adapted and developed this term. The concept is built on the principle that without the freedom of women within society and without a real consciousness surrounding women, no society can call itself free. Women academies have been established in many places in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria to develop this concept of genealogy and to discuss a range of relevant topics. In 2016, the Women's Academy in Diyarbakir established the journal Genealogy, soliciting contributions from Middle Eastern and Western-based feminists, in addition to the writings by Kurdish women activists. Aside from the more internationally oriented intellectual endeavor, the concept is also employed in the education programs of male and female cadres involved in the armed wing of the movement as a tool to stress the significance of gender-based equality as being central to freedom and democracy. And Öcalan's vision of genealogy hinges on a critique of the methods used in traditional social sciences, as well as a critique of Western liberal feminism. Now, in my view, it is questionable in how far Abdullah Öcalan has familiarized himself with the epistemological shifts in the social sciences and humanities over the past decades, as well as the various trends in global feminist thought and activism. Long before Öcalan's call to challenge scientific knowledge production, postmodern, post-structural, Marxist, post-colonial, and transnational feminist epistemologies and politics had already unsettled positivist notions of objectivity. Moreover, many feminist theorists and activists across the globe have criticized and challenged premises of liberal and imperialist feminism. Yet the notion of genealogy does not seem to be built on these various critical strands of thought. Although I'm personally skeptical about the epistemological foundations and theoretical contributions of genealogy, based on the Kurdish women's activist assertions about the centrality of the project, I would argue that it plays an important role. It provides an ideological basis for Kurdish women's rights activists to develop their struggle and find the necessary support amongst the male political leadership as well as the Kurdish population more broadly. However, I would also argue that despite these discursive, ideological, and experiential foundations for politics that centers gender-based equality and justice, the translation and implementation into everyday lives within a political movement, but even more into society more broadly, is of course extremely challenging. And one main limitation, in my view, and this morning we heard Isabel Kesa already talk about this, so one limitation is the failure of the movement to tackle issues around sexuality, where the restrictions put on women, particularly linked to honor-based codes, restricting their mobility, dress codes, ability to socialize and engage in relationships and sexual activities outside of marriage, or whether it is in relation to heteronormativity. According to the Kurdish women I spoke to in southeastern Turkey and in the diaspora, both Kurdish male and female fighters are tasked to be celibate during their struggle, and Isabel spoke about this morning as well, and are tasked to become sexless beings in order to live egalitarian lives. Meanwhile, the organization and control of reproduction and broader sexual relations within wider Kurdish societies have not been challenged. Clearly, the bracketing of sexuality and reproductive rights out of the Kurdish women's struggle for equality and justice and that of the wider political movement is a bargaining with conservative patriarchal gender norms and an attempt to not alienate prevailing notions of morality, honor, and propriety. While militant Kurdish women who died in combat or during suicide attacks have become the new heroines and symbols of the Kurdish nation, women who have remained in villages and towns continue to be circumscribed by conservative norms and attitudes towards gender relations and sexuality. So while I appreciate, feel inspired by, and in solidarity with the Kurdish women's rights struggle, I feel it is also my responsibility and task to point to what I perceive as risks, limitations, problems, and engage in a constructive critical analysis that is grounded in my comparative knowledge of women's revolutionary struggles historically and cross-culturally. Whether it is in the context of my relationship with and analysis of the Kurdish women's movement, or in relationship to my work with and on Iraqi feminists, I have been faced with a challenge to be involved and support existing activism, while also being analytical and at times critical. In the Iraqi context, I see feminists who have been incredibly brave in their struggle for women's rights and their mobilizations against authoritarianism as well as sectarianism, but who do not seem to speak out against atrocities committed by government-linked militia, and also seem to promote the idea that the military provides security, as well as often buying into neoliberal and neoconservative notions of empowerment. So the question is, what is my role as a London-based academic who is involved in transnational feminist activism? This question, of course, points to the wider tensions between feminist activism and academia on the one hand, and I think I've just missed a very interesting discussion. I'm really sorry that I missed it, but I just needed a moment out. So it also points to the politics of location and so the significance of positionality. As I've stated previously, we cannot escape our positionalities and audiences or readers, which come with certain responsibilities and points of emphasis. But trying to avoid the straitjacket of location and positionality, however shifting that might be given people's multiple roles, transnational involvements, and contextual identities, calls for historicizing to avoid essentialist notions of culture and identity. But it also requires attention to regional and local agencies and complicities, as well as historically specific articulations and practices of patriarchy. For many of us based in academia, political engagement and activism does not only seem inevitable in relation to particular subject matters, but importantly, grows out of specific ethical and epistemological frameworks. It would have been absurd for me, for example, to exclusively write to and publish for academic readerships and audiences in relation to my work on the impact of the invasion and occupation on Iraqi women. Of course, the very choice of subject matter is already rooted in a specific feminist politics and feminist approach to knowledge production. So there's clearly a dialectic. This is clearly a dialectic process. And I think there's several questions. So one question would be, so how does our activism influence our academic inquiries, choice of topics, research methods, and ways to engage our research findings and analysis? And how do our academic inquiries, research, and readings influence our political activism? And I assume that amongst you today, there are a range of different positionalities represented, both in terms of location, being based in the region, outside, as well as a range of activist and academic positions. I think it is important to recognize the potential tensions between feminist academia and activism, and the frequent inequality in terms of access to resources, the power and authority to present and produce knowledge, as well as the authority to educate new generations of feminist activists and academics. Yet these power relations and unequal access to resources are not as clear-cut as we sometimes seem to assume. Given that many academic institutions are terribly under-resourced, engaged in serious cuts involving redundancies and lack of research money, and an increased precarity of labor amongst younger generation of academics. Meanwhile, in some contexts and at certain times, feminist NGOs and initiatives might be able to more easily attract funding and support than academics do. I mean, that was certainly the case in Iraq after the invasion between 2005 until, I would say, a couple of years ago, where it was much easier for the emerging feminist organizations to find funding and support than people working in higher education and university. And in terms of knowledge production, and in some settings, activists are perceived to produce more authentic knowledge than academics, although I would personally put a big question mark on the notion of the authentic or even the concept of indigenous knowledge. And I think we already had debates around that early in the conference. I also fear that we are sometimes using the differences between feminist academics and activists in simplistic and possibly polemic terms, as an othering device, and as a tool to silence uncomfortable voices or those we do not agree with. For example, I feel quite uncomfortable about what appears to be a trend of post-colonial feminism bashing. My original critique of the trend to explain everything away by reference to colonialism and imperialism, often ignoring local and regional actors and factors, was prompted by the writings and interventions of specific US-based colleagues who could be categorized under the broad label of post-colonial feminist. Yet I think it is important not to generalize and caricature an incredibly wide field containing a very diverse range of scholars. The writings of Chandra Mohanty, for example, have inspired generations of feminist scholars and activists. Everyone I know in the field, whether it was my former supervisor, Denise Candiotti, I think many of my colleagues who are here today, and myself, have been influenced by some aspects of post-colonial theorizing. So I suggest that we need to be very nuanced and specific in our critical engagements and shy away from dismissing an entire field that has shaped contemporary feminist thought and has been shaped, I would like to stress, it has been shaped by feminist activists in many different contexts. I would also like to point to the continuum of activist and academic engagement. As many feminists have argued on numerous occasions, the binary of knowledge production and activism is problematic. For feminists, doing research, writing, and talking about our research is already a political act. Teaching is a political act. And there are many other activities within university settings often regarded as more overtly activist, ranging from organizing day schools and seminars for a wider public, or activist audiences participating in demonstrations and sit-ins, circulating and signing petitions, and lobbying policymakers, and so on. I assume many of you have been involved in a range of different political activities in various political contexts and at different stages of your academic working lives. At the same time, many of you who primarily self-identify as activists would have engaged in research, writing, giving talks, and the education of others. Some of you might study or engage in academic work as well. Some might move in and out of academia, NGOs, and other more informal organizations. Those of you based at AUB or any other political or any other university for that matter know that there are real challenges linked to specific academic institutions. How do we position ourselves vis-à-vis the vision, politics, and initiatives of the institutions we are employed by or engaged with? Politics inside higher education institutions are important and increasingly problematic with the neoliberalization of education and the increase in censorship and restriction on academic freedom on the one hand, and the instrumentalization of academic freedom to allow right-wing, racist, sexist, homophobic, and Zionist voices to get platforms on the other hand. As feminist scholars and activists, we need to intervene in these debates and engage in academic activism or activist academia. And then I should say there's also the issue of romanticizing activist spaces that occasionally academics themselves have been complicit in. So there's the idea that, because we are studying progressive, leftist politics or feminist spaces, the expectation is that, that we find democratic and egalitarian mechanisms of organizing and decision-making. And sometimes we do that, and that is very inspiring, but the reality is often more complex. Of course, we're human beings. There are tensions, there's rivalry, there's competition, there are personality clashes, and there's even corruption. So I give you one example. One of the Kurdish women's rights organizations I was working with for several years, because I was very impressed with the way that they were working across Iraq and worked with women from Baghdad and other parts, and they were not mainly Kurdish nationalists, but they were mainly feminist. But over several years, I found that the organization was really more responding to available foreign funding, which, I could still sort of live with, but then I found out that they're actually corrupt. And that was really, I won't go into details here, but at that point, clearly that was a red line for me. But how do we deal with that? How do we deal with these insights when writing about the organizations, movements, campaigns, without wanting to discredit or undermine them in their entirety? I think that's a big question. Now, the issue of funding is often problematic. Money is always, problematic and often comes with strings attached or with terrible histories and complicities. But I do wonder whether in relation to universities or NGOs or other relevant initiatives, whether we can really afford to be totally puritanical about it. Can we always be consistent in our politics, or do we have to make compromises and difficult choices? What is acceptable money and what is not? And what are our red lines? The fact is that depending on many factors beyond location and beyond the activist and academia divide, our red lines might not be the same. And our red lines might be shifting, pending on changing contexts and changing power dynamics. There's also the issue of differences in terms of generations. I feel inspired by the younger generations of feminists in the region who, while taking pride in their feminist foremothers, have the confidence to do things differently and take on issues and struggles that were taboo until recently. And maybe, we all don't always have the same idea about red lines, although I don't really want to think about myself as the older generation. That's another issue. Now, as Francois Hasso put it so well yesterday, we inevitably have different desires and aspirations. And even if we broadly agree on the importance of intersectional feminist politics and the indivisibility of struggles, we might, in certain moments and contexts, privilege specific struggles over others, or we might disagree about our tactics and strategies. And that should be okay, in my opinion. Now, while tensions, contestations, and negotiations are productive and necessary, I think we sometimes run the risk of engaging in arguments, conflicts, and create sort of seemingly unbridgeable differences in an unproductive manner, distracting us from the many real crises we are facing on many levels. Now, to conclude, and running the risk of coming across as a bit naive and cheesy, I would like to make a plea for a more gentle, caring, and understanding feminist political culture and practice that ceases to construct what I perceive to be straw enemies from within. I think we need to learn to live with our differences, not glossing them over, but recognizing them, working with them with respect, a dose of humility, and focusing on the struggles that truly matter. Thank you. So I was told there will be a Q&A. We'll take some questions. Ah.
Okay, so thank you very much. We will take sets of 3 questions, answers, and we'll take a few rounds. So any questions? Oh.
Nadje, I very much appreciated the talk, and I was really happy you talked about genealogy, because I've struggled with it because I've been in touch with some of the activists, and it seems to have what I call a dear leader quality.
You know, leader?
I call it a dear leader quality, okay. And but it's really hard because people are very committed to it. It seems very, very radical, and I think this kind of links to this other question of activism, like is there actually a difference between being an academic and being an activist? And I don't mean it, I mean, I'm an activist in multiple contexts, including in academia, but is there something else to being an academic that is required? And I think about it as this kind of critical academic lens where it's not apolitical and it's not objective, but it's sort of different. And I think with genealogy is the one, like recent experience in the last year or two where I very much struggled with it. Also as an editor of a journal, where they wanted to use the journal and the Facebook page, and I really had to sit there and think, well, just because we're a venue for feminist projects, but where does this fall? And if you do this, then why not provide a venue for a variety of other kinds of positions, right? Anyway, so that's my comment / question.
Thank you so much, Nadje, for your very enlightened talk. And I'm so glad with your tacit criticism of some excess of post-colonial approach to how it has been used in this region. Myself, I argue to supplement post-colonial approach by post-authoritarian approach. It means to acknowledge how much authoritarianism shape our behavior, scholarship, knowledge, etc. But if we will apply this, it means that we should criticize BYD in Syria, because I felt a little bit you romanticize this group. You should know that, I mean, many literature argue that they eliminate all the competitor before creating their ideal area where we see this beautiful woman involvement, but this is after doing ethnic cleansing, eliminating their political competitors. Thank you.
Do I need to stand? Okay. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Shukri, and I'm AUB student, and I have a question that concerns about what I call diaspora feminism. I don't know whether it is existed or not, but lately I'm from Somalia, so we have a lot of diaspora that are living outside the country, especially in the Western world. And as we had this long civil war, many people are trying to come, or also we are having a new democracy and still in the process of forming government and things like that. And women want to voice their voice and they really want to involve. But my problem is with the women diaspora that need to help, but instead of helping local women, they are making their lives hard by, bringing concepts and ideas, and also, the quota in the parliament, and most of them are for themselves. So my question is, how can we make these women to step back a little bit and leave these women, decide for themselves what they want? If they are oppressed or not, they can speak for themselves, but generalizing and making them like as if they are all ignorant and they don't understand and you are here to save them, If you can elaborate on that a little bit. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Shall I answer? Yes. Okay, well, thank you all. Yes, same, Francis. I also have been struggling with the idea of genealogy, because I, in terms of the theoretical epistemologic claims it makes, I think it's humbug. I mean, neither do we need to reinvent the wheel in terms of critiquing the positivist stance of knowledge production in terms of objectivity. I mean, we've done that critique. Secondly, I mean, when Abdullah Öcalan wrote this, I mean, he has been in isolation prison for 19 years. He doesn't have access to feminist global thought, and so he hasn't really read, feminist thought, and it's so in terms of the sort of the idea, the sort of creation of a woman's paradigm, and that it's kind of this new thing that is more progressive than feminism, I don't buy it at all. But I can appreciate it both as an academic and as an activist, as a political tool. Yeah, I mean, it does something in terms of the struggle. It's something that women, Kurdish women, use to promote the idea of gender-based equality. But I mean, I'm saying the same thing to Kurdish women. I mean, we just had a conference at SOAS, and there were lots of Kurdish women and men, and we said the same thing, that I don't believe in it as something contributing, that's something new, right? It's a, but that doesn't mean that we cannot appreciate it. And I think it's possible to do that, right? Of course, you might create, I mean, in contrast to what Sari is saying, actually, when I'm in those contexts, I'm very, very critical. And I have to admit, it is true that when I first talked to the Kurdish women, and I have to say I did research in southeastern Turkey, so I never went to northern Syria, okay? And I came there with my experiences, well, from Egypt and Iraq, more recently Iraq, and that sort of really shaped my skepticism. And I was very, very impressed and overwhelmed, and I initially felt very inspired, because, it was amazing for me to hear Kurdish women say, well, we have a problem with nationalism, whether it is Turkish nationalism or Kurdish nationalism. I mean, I thought, oh, wow, this is amazing. Or to say, well, when we speak about conflict, it's not just conflict with the state, it's also a conflict with men. And I think I did go through a period of romanticizing it a bit. I don't think I'm doing that now. I mean, one of the things that I would really like to do, it's one of my aims. I don't know if I manage this, because I know it's very difficult, but I would like to bring together scholars and activists who work on Syria more generally, and people, at least scholars and activists who linked or have worked on northern Syria, because I go to events on Syria and those linked to northern Syria, and it's like different worlds, and even scholars don't talk to each other. And I think it would be useful to have that. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, one of the problems I didn't address this in this talk, but another big issue I have is with the idea of education, meaning reading Abdullah Öcalan and reading more Abdullah Öcalan and reading more Abdullah Öcalan. So, and I mean, that in terms of, I mean, clearly this sort of idea of what the dear leader quality, I mean, it's very much there, and there is clearly authoritarianism. I absolutely see that. But I don't think we can dismiss it, and I know that there are different narratives of what happened. I'm sure that you know, the PYD has engaged in you know, atrocities, but that doesn't totally dismiss, I mean, that there's something happening that I think is quite revolutionary where women are concerned. Now, in terms of the question of diaspora feminism, I think it's a really also an important question. I've thought about that a lot in the context of Iraq, because what you're describing in relation to Somalia, something very similar happened after 2003, after the invasion of Iraq. And as I don't know if as you're aware, but actually it was also Iraqi women in the diaspora who were part of the political opposition who actually lobbied the US and the British government, and we said, you know, you have to bring freedom and democracy and liberate our women. I mean, they were very much complicit in this sort of colonial imperialist feminism. But then even those who were, you know, who were not involved in this, there was this whole, this is of course a phenomenon that often happens. So then, you know, women came, Iraqi women who had been living in the diaspora for 20, 30 years, would go back. I mean, you can't blame them, and people were forced to be outside, you know. Some of them had their relatives killed, and for the first time after Saddam Hussein was toppled, they could go back. But they often came with precisely these sort of patronizing attitudes that you're describing, you know, well, you know, we have lived in, I don't know, Sweden or in the UK or in the States, we know what democracy is, we are democrated, we are educated, and that didn't go down well at all, you know. There was lots of tensions. And many, many of the women, I mean, there were hundreds of women I'm aware of who went. After a year or two, they returned, partly because they couldn't deal with the sort of, well, the lack of security and the risk, but also they didn't feel welcome. But there are some women who managed to stay, and they managed to stay because, again, I think, when I think about them, they had a dose of humility, and they learned how to listen. And they didn't just go in, well, I know how to do it, and you have to follow me. But they actually, you know, and sometimes, and I mean, it's not that the Iraqi women I talked to who hadn't left Iraq and were staying there, it's not that they said, we don't accept anything from outside. They actually said, no, we are curious, we want to know, you know, how other women have done things, and we want to learn, but we don't want to tell them, you know, this is the only way to do it. So, I mean, I can't tell you, you know, what can, you know, I mean, I think the only people who can stop Somali diaspora women from doing what they're doing, I mean, I'm sure not everyone does it, there might be some, you know, there are differences, is by, you know, both those women in the diaspora who feel uncomfortable with it and women inside to, you know, challenge them. And maybe also point to other examples. And I think it's important to also not fall into the trap and say, oh, because you're a diaspora woman, you know, you cannot contribute to our struggle or you cannot help. I think that it's a matter, I think, of really, I mean, listening, taking each other seriously, but particularly women who have been outside, being very sensitive to not being patronizing and overbearing. Do we have time
we'll
for
take
another
round of questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to ask a question, but I want to say something that's important for me. Sorry for sharing. I want to share it with you. I'm a writer, but I never wanted to come any feminist conference. I wasn't interested to come any feminist conference. I didn't like this idea specific, but when I came here, it catch my eyes, and I liked it because it was kind of flu or kind of disease that happened in the society, and paying attention to that was so important. Then I found it important in my life. But every time it was bolding feminism, I was against this idea in my life. But because sometimes feminism is kind of bold and very bold word that I was really had limitation in myself to accept it as kind of problem. But now I see. And also the country that I come from, Iran, has too much problem in this issue. But something that is so interesting for myself is that, for example, in Iran history, many women in the backstage made against the people, even against the life of the other women. Then if I am interested to write anything about feminism, I will write something about feminine against feminism, because, for example, there is a very important criminal in Iran that they made it too much film and video about it, that a football player had two wives, and one of the wives killed the other wife. And I think this kind of, I also am again interested in feminine against feminism, because I think sometimes the women against women, and it also can make some idea of feminism. I'm not sure about this. Sorry for sharing this. I wanted to share only this idea to all the attendance here, because it was so interesting for myself to attend the feminism conference, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nadje. I have two comments / questions. The first one is about what you mentioned in terms of the economy, learning the language of the economy / the quantitative. I think it's not just about learning the language. I think there's a kind of feminism that is invested in quantitative studies, etc., like giving statistics at the UN in terms of international advocacy. But I think it is actually, I don't know, maybe you can comment on that more, like how is it that we can challenge the quantitative field and the economic field as well in terms of the terminology used, the methodology and all of that. And second is related to bridging academia with activism. I personally feel, and thank you for your comments, but in general I feel that we need to move away from this discourse of bridging the gap between academia and activism, and towards a critique of institutions in general, and looking at institutions as modes of, certain sites of power, etc. And how is it that we can envision organizing and restructuring that is not the same in terms of, the way these structures come to be? Thank you.
Okay, so one last question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I just have a question on the post-colonial scholarship on feminism. Me and a bunch of other people, we kind of have this sort of interpretation about the PC scholars, that they're kind of just disconnected from whatever it is they're critiquing or studying, because a lot of them are pretty much in their offices at like Columbia or, I don't know, some big fancy American university in the US or whatever. But like their critiques, some of it, I guess, does hold ground, but other critique just goes too far. So how do we like bridge the divide? Because you were talking about how we shouldn't really dismiss PC scholarship in its entirety, but I don't know, we need to find some sort of middle ground. So yeah.
Okay, that's it? Okay. So I think the first one was a comment. So thank you for it. In terms of the idea that it's not just about learning the language of economy, because you're right. In terms of the whole international gender apparatus and the institutionalized gender machineries, of course, it's the opposite. It's very much, numbers are very much used to illustrate achievement, right? And yes, so I guess what I want to say is that critical feminist scholarship needs to come to grasp with statistics. And we need to be able to not just, so if I see a report like that, I can critique it on one level, but I often fail to understand some of the numbers. And I would sometimes like to have that knowledge and ability to also critique on that level, because we know that, of course, statistics and quantitative findings can be interpreted and used in so many different ways, aside from the fact that often they conceal more than they reveal. So yes, it is not just a matter of learning this, because there are, of course, people who do this, but it's linked to a specific critical feminist lens as opposed to the gender mainstreaming paradigm and the paradigm of women's empowerment. And yes, I think I agree largely. I've been, now when I think about the kind of struggles I'm facing right now in the institution at SOAS, and I think also at, the several NGOs and organizations I've been involved with, there are differences, but there are also similarities. And I don't think, but I didn't want to sort of gloss over differences. And I think someone, yesterday it was Frances, I think, she made the important point. I don't know if it was Frances or Beth, but I think Frances or Beth, I'm not sure, who spoke about the Beth, actually, about the differences in terms of, even if you look at the US, there's so many differences. We cannot, sort of an Ivy League institution as opposed to, a public university that's actually scrambling for funding. And I know so many, especially young academics, who actually have to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to survive, and there's real precarity there. And I know some people, working in NGOs. I'm thinking about Iraq now, where at some point money was poured in, and it was easier in a way to make a career, make a profession. So I think we need to be very specific about what side, and certain things cut across. And then there are some that are probably more specific to activist or academic challenges. So the last question. So, okay. So I will. It's not a secret. So Laila Bologut is a friend of mine, but I have some problems with the way that she and others. I'm thinking of Sabah Mahmoud. There are a whole range of people who I think are writing mainly against U.S. media policy discourse and sort of U.S. racism, imperialism. And actually, I often feel privileged. The UK, I feel, we're going this way. But I do feel, it's easy for me, or I have to be careful in judging my colleagues in the US. I can say so and I can take difference, but I also feel I have to be careful in judging them, because I don't know how I would react if I would be based in New York and would be facing these very horrible, racist, Islamophobic discourses. But my point is, so, I did actually come out in an article and explicitly mention, do Muslim women need saving, and some of the arguments, and distance myself from this constant, what I find occupation, obsession with speaking about imperialism and neo-colonial project, and in some ways inadvertently taking agency away from local actors, but also I think really glossing over local, regional, and national power configurations and articulations of patriarchy, which of course are linked to the global, are linked to neoliberal economics and so on. But I think we have to really be careful to be specific and criticize constructively, gently or not so gently, concrete writings and concrete arguments. But I don't think we really can dismiss an entire field. I mean, it's a little bit like we're all shaped by Marxist thinking. I mean, we cannot, in terms of the importance of material conditions. At this point, I mean, 20 years ago when I started my PhD, we were still debating about the influence of postmodern thought. Of course, we are all shaped by the idea that all knowledge is situated, that there is a relationship between language and, representation and, the way that we are constituted through language. I mean, it's not something that we're debating anymore. I don't think that we can dismiss an entire field that, I would say that everyone, most academics are in some way or another influenced by a scholarship that recognizes not only that, colonialism had an impact on whatever is unfolding, but also that there are neo-colonial power configurations, and they're very real. But the way we then deal with it, there's so many different ways of being a post-colonial feminist. I think, and one of the things that I appreciate what post-colonial feminism did is move beyond the East-West binary and point out that there are, of course, complicities in any previously colonized country, and there have always been people in the West and elsewhere who have been resistant to the powers that be. So that is much more complex. And, we can't just, I think it's just so broad and there's so many different ways. And some people, like Chandra Mohanty, she is not someone who's just sitting in an armchair. She's very closely linked to real struggles. And so are many other scholars. So I think we need to I think it's okay to criticize, and there's certain things that fine, but I don't think it's fair to dismiss an entire field. I said that 3 times now. That's enough.
So thank you very much once again for this thought-provoking talk, and I will now give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Carmen Geha, who will give the closing remarks.
That's going to be very difficult to go after you, Nadje. I can't even see you. I'm just going to try to wrap up. One of the most interesting and overwhelming themes in the last 2 days for us as the conveners has been this positive backlash on the question of feminism in crisis. It can be read both ways, right? Feminism in crisis, and the Arab public sphere is in crisis, and a lot of the presentations sort of emphasize that. And yet there was such a positive reinforcement of the fact that feminism in crisis can accomplish something. In the introductory remarks, I remember my colleague Sarah saying, let's not think of crisis as a rupture, but as an opportunity. And I just want to share with you and ask you to take a moment and to think how much commitment there is, whether in scholarship or activism, to really say that no, feminism is not in crisis, there is a crisis, and feminism can have a role in this crisis. And perhaps one of the questions would be whether feminism can have a role post-crisis. Maybe one of the ways that we can look at it and debunking crisis and thinking of crisis is feminism during revolution and then feminism post-revolution, right? So feminism is playing a role in this crisis, and feminists are playing a role in this crisis, whether as scholars or activists. The question is, will we be able to play a role post-crisis, and is there ever a post-crisis in this part of the world? So this is one of the things that really stayed with us. And the second was this question on more than one panel of activism and academia and state feminism and women machineries yesterday and pedagogy. And I also want to say that this has been something shared in the different panels that we heard. And one of the things that we've been preoccupied with on the breaks is thinking about the question of how to amplify knowledge in its different forms. And the third thing was perhaps that emerged is thinking about methods and strategies and actions. And there's a diversity of that appeared from day one, talking about access to abortion and how lack of access for family planning could actually be a way of gender-based violence, to this afternoon, if you've attended the feminist block, thinking about organizing. And I think one of the questions that also we've been occupied with on the breaks is how do we theorize about impact and what does that mean? And the last thing that really stayed sort of with me and with us, and last night we were thinking about, was the keynote plenary yesterday that Sarah moderated on the question of pedagogy, institutional commitment, shared struggles as scholars working on feminism or working on gender and working on women issues, and how we can perhaps rally further, think further. I don't know the right words. Suffice to say that the crisis will be gendered, at least in our thinking, and that's probably one of the outcomes, just conceptually. Some options for follow-up, some concrete options. We're thinking of at least one special issue, so we'll be putting out a call for that to look at the papers and try to put together maybe one theme or more than one theme. There's another option for follow-up. The Asfari Institute is potentially supporting us to publish a paper or a series of papers on strategies and activism. And so if you think your work ideas has some research or direct experience with tactics, those could be two different kinds of potential publications. And then lastly, I really want to thank once again our sponsors, all our keynotes, and I think it's been overwhelmingly enriching, and I'd like to give another last clap for Beth and Nadje and Huda, Aslah and Francis. Thank you for making a long trip. Aslah, I know your trip wasn't long, but it was difficult, so thank you for coming. And Maya Ashur, يعطيك ألف عافية. Muhammad has been behind our tweets. We were trending yesterday and today, #1. Thank you for that. يعطيك ألف عافية. He's a volunteer. I want to thank our panel chairs, and I want to say how generous the chairs have been in providing feedback and advice in the preparation. We were also positively surprised that, like, whenever we would knock on someone's door, they've been very generous in helping us think through this conference, from small logistics to big questions and ways of framing. So I really want to thank you for that. I want to thank the presenters. I know people have been walking up and saying they've enjoyed the conference, and I feel like we've taken more credit than we deserve. It's been you. Thank you for coming, for your commitment, for your time. It's been truly very much enriching. And thank you for attendees. I've seen people who haven't missed a single panel, like sitting in the front row, always in the back. And I really want to thank you for that. I think it's been a beautiful energy the last 2 days. ويعطيكم ألف عافية. And Sarah and Reem, thanks for bringing me along. I enjoyed this a lot. It's been a lot of learning. I think the best way to learn about feminist theory and practice is to get to work with two feminist scholars and friends, so I'm very proud. It's been an honor. Did I forget anything? All right, dinner is at 7. I hope to see you soon. We'll be in touch. Our handle on Twitter is WGS, Women and Gender Studies _AUB, yes? Sorry. Also, Dr. Rima Majid bribed me with love to announce that for those of you who are going to be in Beirut next week, 26, right? There's a one-day conference. AUB, Dr. Majid is convening with Jadaliya on social movement studies and mobilization strategies. I'll leave the poster here if you want to pick it up. Thank you. Leave your headsets. See, I always forget something.
Yeah, just a reminder to please leave your headsets if you've used them for translation outside. Thank you very much.